Still, the candlelight flickered across the judge's bench as I remembered the night my husband slid divorce papers toward me on our anniversary. As I sat quietly in the courtroom, I kept my hands folded, the same control I'd learned to wear at dinner. While the light reflected off the polished wood, the judge paused, reading a document my husband hadn't prepared for. The same flicker caught my wedding ring as the room shifted from his story to mine. That's when I realized the anniversary wasn't the ending he'd planned. It was the beginning of his exposure. Still watching the light steady, I understood justice doesn't rush. It waits until the truth is signed. Before we start, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. If you enjoy the story, please hit like, subscribe, and join our community. It really helps us grow. The restaurant smelled like butter and wine, a rich, heavy scent that seemed to sit in your chest and linger. The candles flickered gently on the table, casting soft shadows that played across the crisp white linen. It was all so perfectly set. The polished silver, the gleaming glassware, the subtle background hum of quiet conversations at nearby tables. The scene was what I imagined anniversaries were supposed to be: warm, romantic, the beginning of something beautiful. But there was a tension beneath it all, something pulling at me from inside. Andrew was across from me, sitting with that familiar, practiced ease. His smile was wide, his words fluid, everything carefully curated to paint us as the ideal couple. "To growth," he said, raising his glass, "to new chapters." His voice had a melodic, almost rehearsed quality to it, as if he were delivering lines from a script he'd written months ago. The people at the table beside us smiled indulgently, nodding along like they recognized us as the perfect example of a happy couple, successful, put together. It was all too easy for him to pull off, too easy to pretend. I smiled back, raising my own glass, but it tasted bitter. I forced myself to sip, the wine heavy on my tongue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening was about to take a turn, that something had already changed. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this way, like the ground beneath us wasn't as stable as we were pretending it to be. And then, as if the world knew I was already bracing, Andrew did something small but telling. The waiter had placed my dish in front of me, and I glanced at it, a slight frown tugging at my mouth. The temperature was off, a detail I'd let slide at other times but now seemed almost unbearable. Before I could say anything, Andrew cut in. "You didn't ask for that," he said, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the waiter. "She wanted it cooked a little more." His tone was casual, but the words were sharp, dismissive. He laughed, but it was thin, forced. "She's indecisive." The waiter nodded and moved off, clearly trying to diffuse the awkwardness. My cheeks burned, a heat spreading across my skin. The laughter, light and carefree as it seemed, was a reminder of how long he'd done this, how long he'd found amusement in my small human mistakes. I wasn't allowed to be uncertain. My preferences, my choices were always a joke. I picked at my food, pushing the vegetables around my plate. Andrew noticed my lack of appetite and ignored it, launching into another monologue about new beginnings, about the future. But his words felt hollow now, like a performance I was no longer interested in attending. He was the actor, always playing his part, while I was left wondering when I had stopped caring about the script. And then, as if the evening couldn't get any more surreal, he slid something across the table toward me. A slim envelope, sleek, unmarked. The movement was casual, too casual. His fingertips lingered on it just a little too long, a gesture that made it feel less like an offering and more like something he controlled, something he could simply give me, like a directive. I looked at the envelope, a pit growing in my stomach. His hand stayed on it for a moment longer than necessary, a subtle reminder that the power here was still his. The air around me felt suddenly heavier, colder. The small flicker of candlelight now seemed too fragile. Slowly, carefully, I picked it up. The world around me seemed to blur as I opened the flap, the paper inside crisp and impersonal. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the words. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The letters swam before my eyes and the room seemed to go muffled, as though the air had thickened, pulling sound away. The clink of glasses, the laughter of the nearby tables, even the hum of the restaurant itself. All of it receded, leaving only the cold, sharp reality of those words. I looked up at Andrew. He was watching me closely, his eyes steady, perhaps expecting some kind of reaction, some breakdown, but I wasn't sure what he wanted. I had been bracing for something, and yet nothing about it felt real. The finality of it hit differently when it wasn't just a paper or an idea. It was in my hands now. And then, in the silence between us, I understood. This wasn't the start of a new chapter. This was an ending. The car hummed along the highway, the soft whoosh of the tires on the asphalt punctuated only by the tapping of Andrew's fingers against his phone. He drove with one hand on the wheel, a casual precision that made it clear he wasn't thinking about the road ahead. He had somewhere to be, something else to do. My heartbreak was just another thing to squeeze between his meetings, another task on his to-do list. I sat beside him, my hands folded in my lap, unsure of what to say or feel. The silence between us was thick with the weight of the moment, but I could already feel him pulling away, physically, emotionally, leaving me to sit with the mess of what had just happened. My mind raced. How had I ended up here? How had we gone from anniversaries to divorce papers in the span of a dinner? Andrew glanced over at me briefly, his expression unchanged, as if handing me those papers hadn't just shattered something between us. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice even. The words felt rehearsed, too smooth to be real. They were the words someone says to someone they're replacing, not to someone they've spent years with. The dismissal was so complete, so casual, that it stung deeper than any argument ever could. I swallowed, trying to hold it together, but the tightness in my chest made it hard to breathe. "Why now?" I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. "On our anniversary? Why this night?" Andrew laughed once, a sharp, dismissive sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Because it's poetic. Clean ending." He said the words like he was explaining a metaphor, as though he was discussing something abstract and beautiful. But there was nothing poetic about it. It wasn't clean. It was cold. He shifted in his seat, turning slightly to face me. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice taking on that familiar, practiced tone. "Stability, a home, my name. What else do you want from me?" The way he spoke, like he was handing over a list of accomplishments, like he was giving me the things he believed I owed him gratitude for, made something inside me snap. I wasn't some thankless wife just collecting favors to be put on display. I was a person. But there he was, still thinking of everything as transactions, as items to be checked off a list. The words came out before I could stop them. "Is there someone else?" His jaw tightened, the muscles in his face hardening. He didn't answer immediately. The silence that stretched out between us felt long, as if the question had caught him off guard. But I saw the shift in his eyes, the way they darted to the side, his fingers tapping faster on his phone, as if he could escape the question. The radio clicked on, the volume rising just enough to drown out the sound of my breath. It was his way of avoiding an answer. He didn't need to say a word, the radio did it for him. But the message was clear. I wasn't worth answering. The question wasn't worth his time. The car felt even smaller now, like the walls were closing in around us. I turned my gaze out the window, watching the streetlights blur past. The night had gone from romantic to cold, the flicker of the streetlights casting shadows across the dashboard as the weight of the truth sank in. And then, in the silence that stretched between us, I realized something. This wasn't just about the end of our marriage. This was about how he'd always treated me, like a convenient accessory, someone whose needs and feelings could be disregarded because he had everything else under control. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was losing a role I'd been forced to play, a part I'd been cast in without ever being asked if I wanted it. And all of a sudden, the questions didn't matter anymore. It wasn't about whether there was someone else. It wasn't about why now. It was about what I was going to do next. The car pulled into our driveway. The engine cut off, the silence descending again. I stayed seated for a moment, the door still shut. I could feel him looking at me, waiting for me to react, waiting for some final, desperate plea. But there was nothing left to say. The only thing that mattered now was what happened when I finally opened the door and walked out of this. The light from the house spilled over the pavement, illuminating the space between us. And in that moment, I knew. Whatever came next, it was mine to decide. The morning light sliced through the kitchen, harsh and unforgiving, throwing sharp shadows across the counter. I stood at the table. The papers spread out before me like a cruel puzzle. Each clause seemed to strip away something I thought I had. My eyes darted over the fine print, waived claims, no spousal support, full asset control to Andrew. Each sentence felt like a personal loss. It wasn't just the divorce anymore. It was everything I had built, everything I had been reduced to in the fine lines of a legal document. I tried to breathe, to focus, but every word felt like another weight pressing down on me. The kitchen, once a place I'd spent years cooking in, now felt like a cage. My chest tightened with every clause, every term that worked against me. Behind me, I could hear Andrew's footsteps, slow, calculated, as if he were waiting for me to break. I didn't turn to look at him, but I felt the tension in the air, the way he hovered over me, close enough that I could feel his presence, but not close enough to offer support. Then came the sigh, a long, dramatic exhale from behind me, like my act of reading was an inconvenience, an interruption to his carefully orchestrated narrative. "Come on, Samantha," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "This really isn't that hard to understand." I bit my lip, refusing to look at him. I didn't need to explain it to him. I didn't need to explain anything. But he didn't stop. He shifted behind me, as if my words were a delay he hadn't factored in. "You know, your job," he started, his voice oozing that familiar condescension. "It's just hobby money, right? It's not like it was ever really a factor in this." I froze. My job, the one I had fought for, the one that had taken years of my life, was hobby money. His words hung in the air like smoke, too thick to ignore. My heart raced, the unfairness of it swirling in my chest, but I didn't respond. I couldn't. Every word I spoke, every attempt to stand my ground felt like it would be crushed under his weight. Andrew continued, oblivious to the silence that had stretched between us. "The house?" he said, his voice flippant. "It's basically mine anyway. I'm the one who paid for it. You've had your share." He said it like a transaction, like the house was an item on a list, a possession he could claim because he had the power to buy it. I closed my eyes briefly, trying to steady myself, but my throat constricted. This wasn't just a divorce, it was an erasure. He wasn't just taking our shared life, he was wiping me off the record entirely. Then I flipped the page, and my stomach dropped. There, in black and white, was a reference to something I hadn't seen before, an existing post-nuptial agreement. The date was last year. The words blurred before me. My signature was at the bottom, but it wasn't right. My throat went tight, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. The loops, the curves of the letters, none of it was how I wrote. The signature wasn't mine. It was close, but it was wrong. I stared at it for a long time, feeling my heart pound against my ribs. It wasn't the signature itself that shook me. It was the realization that he had orchestrated this entire thing behind my back, had manipulated not just me, but my identity, my trust. He had taken my name, my life, and made it something else entirely. Andrew's voice broke through my thoughts, but I couldn't focus on his words. The room seemed to close in around me, the paper in my hands suddenly feeling heavier than anything else in the world. "What's wrong now?" he asked, sounding almost too casual, like this was just another moment in our routine. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, spinning, trying to make sense of how this could happen, how I could have signed something that wasn't real, How had he made this happen? The air around me felt suffocating, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. Every part of this was calculated, every document, every move, planned. But the biggest lie of all was the one that stood in front of me, that I had ever signed anything willingly. I picked up the phone, hands shaking, and dialed Marisol's number. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let him do this without a fight. And for the first time, I realized this wasn't just a fight for the house, the money, or the things he thought he owned. It was a fight for my identity, for everything he had taken without asking, and I was ready to take it all back. The bank office smelled like paper and cold air conditioning, the kind of place designed to feel neutral and safe, even when it wasn't. Everything was beige and polished, chairs aligned, counters spotless, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. I stood at the counter gripping my ID, my hands shaking no matter how tightly I told them not to. I hadn't planned to come here today, but after seeing that signature, almost mine but wrong, I couldn't sit still. I needed facts, numbers, dates, something that didn't depend on Andrew explaining things in that patient, condescending voice that always made me doubt myself. "I have a question about account activity from last year," I said, keeping my voice even. "Around the date of a postnuptial agreement." The teller nodded politely and began typing. The clicking of the keyboard felt loud in the quiet space. I watched her eyes track across the screen, watched her pause. She looked up at me. "Did your husband authorize this inquiry?" For a split second, I couldn't breathe. The heat rushed behind my eyes, sharp and humiliating. Even here, even now, I was being treated like a secondary signature in my own life, like curiosity required permission. I started. "That's not necessary," another voice said calmly. Ms. Patel stepped forward from a nearby desk. She was composed, precise, the kind of person whose calm didn't come from indifference, but from experience. She took my ID, glanced at it once, then nodded to the teller. "I'll take over." The teller retreated, and Ms. Patel gestured toward a small conference table near the window. I sat, my legs unsteady, my heart beating too fast. "Tell me what you're looking for," she said. "There's a document dated last year," I explained. "A postnuptial agreement. I don't remember signing anything. I want to know if there was unusual activity around that time." She didn't question me. She didn't ask if I was sure. She simply turned her screen toward me and began scrolling. "Let's look at the timeline," she said. The first item appeared quickly. "Here's a payment to a notary service," she noted. "Same week as the date on that agreement." My stomach tightened. She scrolled again. "Here's a transfer to a legal services firm, substantial amount, also same window." The room felt colder. Then she stopped. "And here," she said carefully, "is a mailing address change." I leaned forward. "That's not our address." "No," she replied. "It's a P.O. box, opened shortly after those transactions." My hands curled into fists in my lap. Andrew had been moving pieces quietly, planning something I hadn't even known existed. Ms. Patel hesitated for half a second, then clicked again. "There's one more thing you should see." She pulled up a scanned document submission attached to my profile. The file name was generic, administrative, the kind meant not to draw attention. When she opened it, my breath caught. "This document was uploaded to your account," she said, "but not from a device associated with you." The timestamp glowed on the screen, the device ID, the upload location. None of it matched my phone, my laptop, anything I had ever used. I stared at it, the realization settling slowly, heavily. He hadn't just prepared paperwork without me. He had paid people, moved money, changed addresses, uploaded documents under my name from a device that wasn't mine. He had treated my identity like a tool, something he could borrow and return without consequence. "I can print all of this," Ms. Patel said gently. "Transaction logs, submission records, everything." "Yes," I managed. As the printer hummed behind us, I felt something shift inside me. The signature hadn't been the start of this. It hadn't even been the betrayal I thought it was. It was proof. Proof that Andrew hadn't acted impulsively or emotionally. He had planned an exit. And whatever he thought he'd secured with paperwork, he'd done it by underestimating how far I was willing to follow the trail. The office smelled like coffee and toner, the scent sharp and reassuring in a way that made the world outside feel distant, quieter. Marisol, the lawyer Claire had recommended, was already seated at a clean, modern desk. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and the windows let in just enough light to give the space a professional yet warm feel. But despite the calm, my heart was racing. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was betrayal being laid bare. I sat down, the chair colder than I expected, and placed the files on the table between us. Marisol glanced over them quickly, her eyes flicking from document to document before looking up at me with calm, practiced precision. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her voice even, professional, but with an undertone that made it clear she knew this wasn't just about the papers. I took a breath, forcing myself to focus. "I've been looking at some documents, specifically the post-nuptial agreement. There's a signature on it, but I'm sure I never signed it. I think it was forged." She nodded, not skipping a beat. "Let's verify it. We'll start with the notary's journal. I'll request it, and once they hear forgery, they'll cooperate." I hesitated for a moment, then admitted, "I trusted Andrew with all of this. I've always let him handle the paperwork, especially when it came to things like financial agreements. He made me feel like asking questions was unnecessary, like I should just trust him." Saying it out loud was like confessing a weakness I hadn't fully acknowledged. My cheeks burned and I could feel the shame creeping up my neck. Marisol's expression softened, just a fraction. "It's not stupid to trust your spouse. It's manipulation to take advantage of that trust." Her words grounded me, if only slightly. I nodded and swallowed down the raw emotion, focusing instead on the task ahead. She picked up the phone and dialed, speaking in legal terms I couldn't follow. A few minutes later, she hung up and turned to me. "They've agreed to release the notary's journal," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It should arrive by the end of the day. We'll see who signed that document." Hours later, the notary's log was in my hands. My pulse quickened as I flipped through it, finally landing on the entry for the postnuptial agreement. Marisol scanned the page, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read aloud. "Signatory, Samantha Harper. ID number." She paused. "But look here, there's a discrepancy. The ID number doesn't match yours. And the description of the signer, blonde, 5'6", small wrist tattoo." My stomach dropped. The signature was a blur in my mind. I hadn't signed it. But the description, that's when everything clicked into place. Jenna. I didn't have a wrist tattoo. I never had. But Jenna did. I remembered now, back at that barbecue last year, when she rolled up her sleeve to show it off, laughing about how she'd gotten it on a whim. She had never mentioned anything about signing anything, but I'd seen her at that time. It was a moment I'd forgotten, tucked away under the weight of everything else, but it was there now, undeniable. "Andrew's work friend," I whispered. "He had her sign for me. He used her instead of me." Marisol sat back in her chair, processing the information. Her gaze was steady, assessing. "That's a serious violation. If he's used Jenna's signature in this way, it not only invalidates the agreement, it could also open him up to fraud charges. Your signature is essentially null, and his attempt to use it could backfire legally." I felt a weight lift slightly, but only slightly. The fight wasn't over. This wasn't a victory. This was a small crack in the facade Andrew had so carefully built, and the truth, like a quiet storm, was just beginning to gather. "I'm going to need you to sign these documents," Marisol said, sliding a few pages toward me. "We'll need to request a fraud investigation from the court and ensure we're protecting your interests." I nodded, but the action felt too small, too distant from the enormity of what had been done. I wasn't just fighting for my home or the money he thought he controlled. I was fighting to reclaim something far more precious: my identity. I signed, and the pen felt heavy in my hand, a quiet, definitive act of reclaiming control. As I pushed the papers back to Marisol, I couldn't help but glance at the clock, ticking quietly on the wall. There was a long way to go, but now I wasn't just reacting. I was moving forward, and I wouldn't let him erase me any longer. I dialed Jenna's number with a steadiness I didn't feel. The phone rang, dragging on, and the silence between each ring stretched like an eternity. When she finally picked up, her voice was light, too light for what I needed to say. "Hey, Sam," she said, the casual tone at odds with the storm brewing inside me. "What's up?" I forced my voice to stay even. "I need to talk to you about last year, the post-nuptial agreement." I didn't want to sound confrontational, but I couldn't ignore the edge in my own words. I saw something in the notary log. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing, too quickly, too shallow. Finally, she responded, a small tremor in her voice. "What about it?" I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my tone steady. The log describes the signer as blonde, 5'6", with a wrist tattoo. That sounds like you, Jenna. The line was quiet. Too quiet. "Jenna," I pressed, watching the seconds tick by. She exhaled slowly, like the breath had been trapped inside her the whole time. "Oh, Sam. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I tried to keep my composure, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. "What the hell, Jenna? Why would you do this?" She swallowed hard, and for the first time I heard the guilt in her voice. "I didn't think it would ever come to this. He said it was just paperwork, just to protect assets, nothing big." Her words tripped over each other, stumbling over the truth she could no longer hide. "He told me you'd already agreed to it. He said it was just a formality." I sat down at the kitchen table, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a lead blanket. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. I couldn't speak for a moment, couldn't wrap my mind around the idea that Jenna, my friend, my confidant, had helped him with this. It didn't make sense. But it was all adding up now. "Did you ever think to question it?" I asked, my voice low, tight. "Did you ever think to ask me?" Jenna's voice cracked. "I didn't know it would go this far, Sam. I didn't know he was going to leave you. I didn't know he'd do this." My heart squeezed, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not for her, not for Andrew either. "But you knew it was wrong," I said, each word heavier than the last. "You knew it was a lie." "I didn't think it was that big of a deal," she whispered, as if her excuse could make this all go away. "He just asked me to help out. I didn't know." Her voice trailed off. The anger bubbled up inside me, sharp and cold. "I trusted you, Jenna. I trusted you, and you let him use you. You let him use me." "I'm so sorry, Sam," she said, her voice a soft plea. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was helping. I didn't think—" She stopped again, realizing it wouldn't matter. "I didn't know he'd use it to leave you. I didn't know he was planning all of this." The betrayal stung worse than I could have imagined, not just from Andrew, but from Jenna, too. The person I'd thought of as a friend, someone I'd trusted, someone I'd confided in, had turned out to be another part of his lie. "You're just as much a part of this as he is," I said, the words coming out colder than I intended, "and I'm done letting people make excuses for him, and for you." She went silent, and I could hear her breath hitching on the other end of the line. I wasn't sure what I expected from her: remorse, regret, guilt, but it didn't change the fact that what had been done couldn't be undone. She had been complicit, and no apology would fix that. "I need you to tell me everything, Jenna," I said, my voice firmer now. "Everything. I need to know how far he went." There was a long pause, and I could feel the hesitation in her silence. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll tell you everything. I'll tell you what he said, what he asked me to do. I closed my eyes, the weight of her confession settling in. This wasn't just about the house or the money or the post-nup anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, and the shattering of something I'd believed in. But now, at least, I had the truth, and it was the truth that would bring everything into the light. The fight was only just beginning. "I'll talk to you soon," I said, ending the call. The words felt final, but my mind was already racing, sorting through the pieces. The damage had been done, but it wasn't over. Not yet. I wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. The bank lobby was busy in a way that felt insulting. People stood in line to deposit checks, to ask about interest rates, to do ordinary things. I sat in a small conference room with Ms. Patel again, surrounded by glass walls and polite signage that promised security. My hands were steadier this time, not because I felt better, but because numbness had turned into focus. Ms. Patel opened my profile and pulled up the transaction history like she was unspooling a thread. Her face stayed neutral, but I could tell by the way she slowed down that she was seeing the same pattern I was. "You asked about unusual activity after the postnuptial date," she said. "There's a cluster." She turned the monitor toward me. Several transfers sat there like footprints in fresh snow, consistent amounts, repeated routing numbers, always moving outward. The destination account name looked like a business entity, clean, generic, the kind of name designed to blend into a ledger without raising eyebrows. Ms. Patel clicked into the details. "This account was opened shortly after the notary payment," she said, "and it's been receiving these transfers regularly." My throat tightened anyway. Andrew had been telling me we needed to budget. He'd said it casually, like it was teamwork. "Let's be smart this month. Maybe we skip the trip. Do we really need to replace the patio furniture?" He'd made me feel childish for wanting anything beyond the bare minimum, like restraint was maturity and I was always the one who needed correcting. And all that time, he'd been feeding a second life in silence. Ms. Patel printed the transfer records, sliding them across the table in neat stacks. The paper felt warm from the printer, like the truth had its own temperature. I scanned the dates, the amounts, the rhythm of it. It wasn't panic spending, it was planned, predictable, a routine. "This is enough to flag," Ms. Patel said. "If your attorney requests it, our fraud team can widen the review." "My attorney will," I said, hearing how flat my voice sounded. Later that afternoon, I sat in Marisol's office while she dictated preservation letters with the same calm she used when ordering lunch. Bank records, email portals, any financial advisors or third-party services Andrew had touched, every trail that could be erased if we waited. "We preserve first," she said, not looking up. "Feelings later." The phrase should have sounded harsh, but it felt like rescue. Claire sat beside me on the couch, her knee bouncing once before she caught herself. I watched Marisol's hands move across the page, neat and controlled, while my phone lit up again. "Andrew, sign today and we can be friends." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Friends. Like our marriage was a business deal that could end with a handshake, like if I signed quietly, he could keep telling people the story he liked. Two adults choosing peace. No mess, no questions. I didn't respond. That night, with the bank printout spread across Claire's kitchen table, I started matching numbers to receipts I hadn't known to look for before. It was like learning a new language in reverse, translating my own life into evidence. Storage unit payments, a lease deposit, charges for new furniture from a place we'd never shopped, delivery fees to an address I didn't recognize. None of it matched our household. None of it matched the life he claimed we were protecting with budgeting. Claire leaned over my shoulder, quiet but present. "That's not a hobby," she murmured, seeing the lease deposit. "That's a setup." I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my lungs like I'd been holding it for months. Andrew hadn't just planned to divorce me. He'd planned to relocate the future, without me in it, while I was still washing his dishes and believing his lectures about discipline. My phone buzzed again. "Andrew, don't make this ugly." I stared at the words, then at the receipts, then at the transfer log stacked like a staircase leading somewhere I hadn't been invited. Ugly wasn't what I was making. ugly was what he'd built. And now that I could see the blueprint, I knew exactly what the next step was. I reached for my phone, not to reply to Andrew, but to forward everything to Marisol. Because the more he tried to keep his narrative clean, the clearer it became. He hadn't been leaving me. He'd been extracting himself, piece by piece, while I was still standing in the house he called his. The HR office felt colder than it needed to be, with fluorescent lights humming overhead. Marisol sat beside me, already logged into the system, while Claire sat close enough to touch my knee, her presence grounding, even if I wasn't sure I could be grounded. "Let's pull the benefits records," Marisol said, clicking through with a quiet efficiency. Her focus was absolute, but there was no mistaking it. This wasn't just another form or file to her either. We were looking for something real, something damning. The screen refreshed, and Andrew's name appeared at the top. Beneath it, the familiar lines of coverage and elections scrolled by, mundane at first. But then Marisol paused. "Here," she said. "The dependent section." My eyes immediately locked onto the date, weeks before the anniversary, before the divorce papers had been handed to me. "He marked you as separated," Marisol read aloud. "Effective date, prior to service." I felt something cold coil in my chest. Separated, before he even served me the papers. His exit had already begun before I'd had a chance to see it. Marisol scrolled further, and my breath caught. "This," she said quietly, "is the dependent he tried to add." My eyes shot to the name. It wasn't mine, but that wasn't all. The description beside it, blonde, 5'6", small wrist tattoo, was like a gut punch. It matched perfectly. Jenna. I blinked, struggling to breathe. The notary log had said it. And now this. He'd already replaced me in the official records, made it official before I'd even known it was happening. "He tried to put her on his benefits," I whispered. Marisol nodded. The request wasn't finalized, but the intent is clear. I couldn't process it fully. I had been in the dark, thinking I was just struggling with our marriage, with his control. But now I saw the depths of it. He hadn't just wanted a divorce. He wanted a clean break. He had planned everything down to the smallest detail, replacing me in the system before he even took the first step. Marisol clicked again, revealing a new field. "The emergency contact," she said. I watched the screen as it loaded and felt the air leave my lungs. The space was blank. My name had been there for years. My name was the one on every form, every emergency call. But now there was nothing. I stared at the blank space as if it could explain everything. He had already erased me. I didn't know what to feel at first. Betrayal? Anger? Maybe just a dull, hollow ache? Claire's hand tightened around mine, her voice quiet but sharp. "He thinks you'll just shrink." The words hung in the air, the truth of them sinking in. He had expected me to comply, to fade away, quietly, without a fight. I shook my head, gathering the small shred of clarity I could muster. He might have thought I would shrink, but I wasn't going anywhere. The battle had only just begun. The mediation room smelled like stale coffee and old carpet. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and Ruth, the mediator, sat across from us, her tone as neutral as her surroundings. Her voice didn't comfort me. It only made the room feel smaller, colder. Andrew sat beside me, posture stiff, trying to maintain control. Carter, his lawyer, sat next to him, his polished demeanor attempting to mask the tension in the air. They thought this would be a quick, clean negotiation. But I wasn't interested in a clean break anymore. I wanted the truth. Ruth's voice broke the silence. "Let's begin," she said, clicking through the documents. "We'll go over the facts." Andrew spoke first, his voice casual. "Sam's just upset," he said, his words dismissive. "This could have been a simple divorce, but she's making it harder than it needs to be." Micro-humiliation. He always did this, making me seem unreasonable. But not today. Not in front of Ruth. Not now. Marisol's voice was steady as she responded. "We've gathered evidence that shows a different picture. She opened the folder and began to present the documents methodically. Here's the notary log. The signature on the postnuptial agreement doesn't match Samantha's. She paused, letting the words land. Carter tried to interrupt, but Marisol continued without hesitation. The document was uploaded from a device that wasn't registered to Samantha, she added, eyes never leaving Andrew's face. I saw the shift in Andrew's expression, his earlier confidence fading. The walls he had built around his lies were starting to crumble. Marisol turned the page, revealing the next piece of evidence. Here we have the benefits records. Andrew attempted to add a dependent, someone described as blonde, 5'6", with a wrist tattoo. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Jenna. Andrew's jaw clenched, and I could feel the weight of his panic rising under the surface. He hadn't expected any of this. Who was this person? Ruth asked, her voice neutral but firm. Someone we both know, Marisol said, not missing a beat. A friend of Andrew's. Ruth's eyes flicked to Andrew, waiting, but he didn't answer. I took the opportunity to slide a single-page affidavit across the table, Jenna's statement, admitting she had signed for me. Ruth read it quietly, and the air seemed to tighten around us. "That's serious," Ruth finally said, her voice sharper now. The tone had changed, the balance of power shifting. Andrew's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but Marisol cut him off. "We're filing a fraud report and requesting sanctions for bad faith filings," she said. I could feel the weight of her words settle over the room. Carter's protests died in his throat, and I knew then that this wasn't going to be the simple divorce Andrew had hoped for. His facade had cracked, and the truth was coming out. Ruth turned her gaze to Andrew, who was now visibly unsettled. "You'll need to explain this in court," she said. "We're done here for today." For the first time, Andrew was silenced. And for the first time, I wasn't just a victim. I was a player in this fight. The guest room at Claire's felt like a sanctuary. The sheets, fresh with detergent, smelled of safety. It was a sharp contrast to the place I'd just left, the house I once called home. I'd packed the essentials, a few clothes, toiletries, and memories, but left everything else behind. The weight of it was heavy, but there was a strange calm in the quiet here. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to steady my thoughts. The world outside was still in motion, but here, in this small, temporary space, I could breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up with another message from Andrew. My stomach dropped as I saw the photo, a picture of the house. Our house. The house I had walked away from. "Still plenty of room for you if you behave." The words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. The casual tone, the possessiveness. He wasn't asking for me to come back. He was reminding me that he still held the keys to everything, that he was still in control. I couldn't respond. I wouldn't. This wasn't a conversation I needed to have with him. There was nothing left to say that he hadn't already erased with his actions. The temporary orders Marisol had filed today were starting to take effect. Asset restraints, exclusive use provisions. The house, for now, was no longer his to control. The world I had lived in for years was shifting beneath my feet, and I was starting to see how far Andrew had gone to hide his plans. He'd built an exit strategy while I was still thinking we were working on a future together. That night, I sat in Claire's kitchen, documents spread out before me. The weight of it still felt surreal. Receipts, bank transfers, emails. The evidence was stacking up. Every move Andrew had made was being logged, preserved. The truth was getting clearer, and yet there was still a part of me that struggled to reconcile what had been my life and the mess he had made. Another text from Andrew buzzed in. This time, it was a photo of the backyard, the same place we'd spent so many mornings, laughing, talking about our future. I couldn't look at it without feeling a sharp pang in my chest. "Don't make this ugly." The words felt almost absurd coming from him. He was the one who had made it ugly, who had turned everything into a lie. And now, with the walls crumbling around him, he wanted to make it look clean. He wanted to paint me as the villain, the unstable one. But I wasn't going to play into it. He was spinning a narrative, trying to paint himself as the victim, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. He had started a smear campaign with our mutual friends, telling them I was unstable, repeating the script he had rehearsed for years. But this time, I stayed silent. Publicly, I remained quiet. On paper, though, I was loud. Every email, every filing, every timeline I had built was another step toward the truth. I knew what he was doing. He thought I would shrink, fade away quietly, and let him keep the story clean. But I wasn't going to let him. I wasn't shrinking. I was standing up and I was fighting back. I put my phone down and let the weight of the day settle in. It was far from over, but now I had the leverage. And with each step forward, I was getting closer to taking back everything he had tried to erase. The fight was just beginning. But for the first time, I felt like I was ready for it. The paperwork felt heavier than ever as I sat at the desk, staring down at the fraud report I had just filed. The words on the page blurred in front of me, but the implications were crystal clear. This wasn't just about reclaiming what Andrew had tried to take. This was about exposing him for what he truly was. I hit send, the action somehow final and weighty, like a door slamming shut on a chapter of my life I could never go back to. Marisol had walked me through the process, explaining how the forged post-nuptial agreement and the identity mismatch in the notary log were enough to make this a legitimate case of fraud. The documentation was airtight, proof that Andrew had manipulated me, stolen from me, and used my name without permission. It wasn't just paperwork anymore. It was the proof that he had planned everything down to the smallest detail, assuming I would go along with it all. As soon as I filed the report, Andrew's first response came. A text and then an email that landed in my inbox almost simultaneously. "How dare you accuse me?" The words sent a jolt through my chest, but it wasn't surprise. It was just more of the same. The same gaslighting, the same manipulation, the same victim act he'd pulled for years. He couldn't even admit his wrongdoings. He couldn't even face the truth. I read his words again, the anger bubbling up in my throat. His tone, like my signature was his to borrow, like everything I had been through meant nothing, was the same dismissive tone that had broken me so many times before. I set my phone down, trying to focus on what mattered. Andrew's response didn't matter. What mattered were the steps Marisol and I were taking to ensure he couldn't destroy the evidence. The bank had already frozen the suspicious transfers and flagged the P.O. box address change as unauthorized pending investigation. Every digital trace Andrew had left was now being scrutinized. There was nowhere for him to hide. But the most important piece of the puzzle was still Jenna. Her guilt had turned into something else now, cooperation. Her texts, once hesitant and apologetic, were now filled with raw honesty. She had sent me a message just an hour ago, agreeing to help however she could. I had known she was starting to crack, but now she was fully in it, ready to face the consequences of her actions. She had provided texts where Andrew had clearly instructed her on what to say if questioned. He had planned it all, telling her that I had already agreed to sign, that it was just a formality, that it would protect assets. He had manipulated her as easily as he had manipulated me. The thought of it made me sick. Jenna hadn't just betrayed me. She had helped Andrew in his attempts to destroy my life, his plan to remove me completely. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the evidence now stacked in front of me. It was overwhelming, and yet it gave me a sense of purpose. I had been living in the dark for so long, unsure of how far Andrew had gone or what his true intentions were. But now, the veil was lifting. Everything was coming to light. I forwarded the texts to Marisol, the truth spreading like wildfire. I could almost feel Andrew's panic rising, even though he hadn't spoken a word about it yet. He could hide behind his smile all he wanted. But his lies were unraveling piece by piece, and it was no longer just a matter of his deceit. It was a matter of legal consequence. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't just about winning or losing a divorce. This was about justice, and Andrew was about to face it head on. I could feel the weight of it all, the weight of the truth, the weight of every lie he'd told. But as the pieces came together, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For the first time, I wasn't the victim in his story. I was writing my own. The fight wasn't over, but I was no longer standing alone. The courthouse hallway smelled like stale paper and impatience. The hard tile beneath my feet seemed to echo louder than usual, as if amplifying every step I took. I was just outside the mediation room when I saw Andrew approach. His movements were slow, calculated, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. He looked wounded, like someone who had been wronged. Except this was all part of his act. The cameras weren't here, but he had that same soft expression he used when trying to manipulate the scene, the one he'd worn for years, expecting people to believe it. "Sam," he said, his voice low, almost coaxing. "I know things have been hard, but we can fix this." I didn't respond immediately. I knew what was coming next. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, scanning for any sign of witnesses, like he was calculating how much of his performance would be needed to get the outcome he wanted. "I've been under a lot of stress," he continued, the words flowing easily as if he were reading from a script. "Work, loneliness. It's been too much." His tone was gentle, almost pleading, like he expected me to empathize with him. Micro-humiliation. The way he spoke about stress and loneliness, as if those were the reasons for what he'd done, felt like an insult to my intelligence. He wasn't owning up to his choices. He was twisting the narrative, playing the victim. And it was so typical of him. I could feel my blood pressure rise, but I didn't let it show. I stayed still, my face neutral, because this was no longer about him or his manipulations. He leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping even lower. "Look, I can offer you something generous if you drop the fraud claims. We can put all this behind us, for the sake of, well, everything we've built." His words lingered in the air between us. Generous. That was the word he used, like he was offering me something out of his kindness. But I wasn't stupid. He wasn't offering me generosity. He was trying to buy my silence, trying to make me fold with promises of security. But I wasn't folding anymore. I could hear Carter's voice from the other side of the hall, where he stood with Marisol. "Don't drag names through the mud," he called over to her, his words just loud enough for me to catch. He was trying to paint the truth as cruelty, to make me look like the one causing harm by exposing the lies. I held my ground, refusing to let their words rattle me. I was calm, colder than they expected. They thought I'd crumble under the weight of their pressure. They thought they could frame me, make me the emotional one who couldn't handle the truth they were spinning. But I wasn't buying into it anymore. Ruth, the mediator, passed by at that moment. She didn't look at us directly, but did just enough to avoid seeing the truth of what was happening. I noticed how she quickly averted her gaze, as if she didn't want to be dragged into something real. Andrew's words trailed off as I stared at him, silent. His smile flickered, then died as he realized I wasn't going to react the way he expected. I wasn't crying. I wasn't begging him to see reason. I wasn't even angry, not in the way he wanted me to be. Instead, I just stood there, calm, the evidence of his betrayal now a solid, undeniable force in my hands. The weight of it had shifted, and this time it wasn't him in control. "I'm not going to let you control the story anymore," I said, my voice firm. I could see the panic creeping into his eyes now. He had always thought he could manipulate me, control the narrative with the ease of a few carefully chosen words. But now, the truth was out, and he was about to face it. "See you in court, Andrew," I added, and I turned away before he could say another word. The walls were closing in on him, and this time I wasn't the one who would shrink. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with the weight of what was about to unfold. Andrew's lawyer, Carter, stood confidently, presenting the post-nuptial agreement as if it were a solid, unshakable truth. His voice was calm, practiced, and he seemed sure that this would end everything. But I knew better. Andrew, sitting next to him, wore that familiar, tight smile, the one he thought could convince anyone that he had everything under control. He looked at me, that small smirk playing on his lips, as if to say, "I've won." But I wasn't the victim in his narrative anymore. Marisol slid a new set of documents across the table, the notary log and the sworn affidavit that would shatter Andrew's performance. I watched as the Judge Whitman, leaned forward, his focus now entirely on the papers in front of him. The room felt smaller, the atmosphere heavier. "Your Honor," Marisol began, her voice steady, "the signature on this post-nuptial agreement does not match Samantha's." There was no immediate reaction from Carter or Andrew. The judge merely flipped through the papers, comparing the notary's description, blonde, 5'6", small wrist tattoo, with the signature on the post-nuptial agreement. My stomach clenched. It wasn't my description, it was Jenna's. I barely registered Andrew's shifting posture as he squirmed in his seat. The quiet that followed was deafening. The truth was unfolding, and Andrew wasn't prepared for it. Judge Whitman looked up at Andrew. "Explain this discrepancy." Andrew hesitated. The smile that had lingered on his face for so long faltered, then faded entirely. "It's a clerical error," he muttered, his voice shaky. "Just a mistake." But the judge was no longer looking at Andrew with the same indifference. He could tell. We could all tell. Marisol didn't pause. She reached over, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. It was Jenna's affidavit, her confession that she had signed the document on Andrew's behalf, under the guise that it was just a formality. "Your Honor," Marisol continued, "we're also filing a fraud report, and we request sanctions for these bad faith filings." The air in the courtroom shifted again, and Andrew's composure finally cracked. His hands clenched into fists, and his lips pressed into a thin line. The facade was crumbling. The judge didn't blink. "This is serious," he said, turning his gaze to Andrew, "and we will address it in court." I could feel the power shift. Andrew, who had spent years manipulating me and everyone around him, was now the one in the hot seat. The control he had fought so hard to maintain was slipping away. As I stood to leave, I felt the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about winning a divorce anymore. It was about reclaiming everything he'd stolen from me. The lies, the manipulation, the control. It was about standing tall, finally free. The fight wasn't over, but the game had changed. For the first time in years, I felt like I was winning. The fallout didn't arrive with a bang. It came the way consequences usually do. Quietly, through systems Andrew used to treat like furniture. Reliable, unmovable, beneath notice. It started with an email Marisol forwarded to me, subject line bland enough to pass as routine. Notice of administrative action. It wasn't from the court, it was from his employer's HR department. Formal language, measured tone, no emotion. They'd received fraud allegations connected to legal filings and benefits activity. An internal investigation had been opened. Andrew was being placed on leave pending review. Leave. A word that sounded temporary, polite, until you heard it the way people inside companies hear it. Step away from your badge. Step away from your access. Step away from the story you've been selling. I stared at the screen until the letters stopped looking like letters and started looking like a crack in a wall. Andrew had always loved control that didn't look like control. He liked systems. He liked status. He liked being the person people assumed was competent, a man who handled things. Now the system was handling him. The shift reached our social circle next, almost like weather. Mutual friends who used to praise him. Andrew's so reliable. Andrew's so level-headed, went quiet. Their silence didn't come with support for me. It came with calculation, then curiosity, then carefully spaced questions that pretended to be concern. I saw it in the way invitations stopped arriving, in the way group chats went dormant, in the way people stopped tagging him in posts like he was a brand. Proof changes social gravity. The same people who once orbited him began to drift. unsure whether his shine was safe to stand near. Meanwhile, the bank continued its internal review. Ms. Patel's emails became more precise, more procedural. The P.O. Box address change was now flagged as unauthorized. The transfer web, those consistent withdrawals into the business-labeled account, was being mapped into a timeline that didn't resemble marital misunderstanding anymore. It looked like planning. It looked like an exit strategy with receipts. Marisol negotiated from strength now, not desperation. Every call she took had the calm of someone holding a winning hand. The record favored truth. And truth, when documented, doesn't require persuasion. It requires follow-through. Late one night, while Claire slept down the hall and the house settled into silence, a voice memo came in from Jenna. Her voice trembled. Words stumbled over each other. Apologies stacked like fragile bricks. "I didn't know. I'm sorry," he told me. She sounded small in a way I didn't trust, not because she was lying, but because she wanted forgiveness to do the work accountability should. I listened once. No replay. Then I forwarded it to Marisol. No response, no emotion, just evidence. After that, I sat in the dark with my phone face down on the table, waiting for the familiar ache to rise, rage, grief, anything that would prove I was still trapped in their story. But what I felt instead was a steady clarity. Andrew's world was finally receiving him the way paper does, without charm, without excuses, without mercy. And if the first crack was HR, and the second was the bank, I could already see the third forming ahead of us, cold, bright, and inevitable, court. The courtroom smelled sterile, clean, like a place where people come to tie up loose ends, a place where stories end, but not always neatly. As I stood there, my documents filed, boundaries set, I felt a strange weight lifting from my shoulders. This was it, the end of the legal battle, the finality that didn't quite feel like closure, but more like a deep breath. Andrew's lawyer, Carter, was still trying to work his angle, pushing for leniency, but no one was listening anymore. The judge had signed the final papers, clean boundaries, protected finances, the notary fraud, the forged signatures, and the manipulated records all clearly laid out. It was like someone had taken the map of our life together, crumpled it, and spread it back out on the table, each crease a truth Andrew hadn't planned on facing. I stood there at the edge of the room, watching the last of it unravel, and I remembered the anniversary dinner that had started this whole mess. The evening he'd slid divorce papers across the table, as though it was the final act of a play he'd been rehearsing. I could still feel the sting of it, the betrayal wrapped in the polite formality of a dinner that was supposed to be a celebration. His voice echoed in my mind, telling me not to make a scene. And now, standing here, I realized that the scene hadn't been mine to make. It was his. As the judge wrapped up the final details, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Everything was in place, everything that had been hidden, manipulated, twisted, laid bare. The financial restraints on Andrew were more than just numbers now. They were real. He had no control. His performance was over. When I left the courtroom, I didn't walk out as a woman discarded. I walked out as someone returned to herself. The woman who had been buried beneath the weight of his lies, the woman who had trusted when she shouldn't have, was gone. I hadn't just won the case. I had taken back something much more valuable, myself. And for the first time in years, I was holding the pen. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. I stood for a moment, just breathing, letting the cool air fill my lungs. I felt clear-headed, a sense of control that had been missing for far too long. I had rebuilt slowly, separate accounts, new routines, therapy, friends who didn't require me to shrink into a role I wasn't made for. I had rebuilt the life I wanted, the life that was mine, and this victory, quiet as it was a testament to that. Andrew's poetic ending had become nothing more than a legal record of his own choices. Not my defeat, his. The court had heard the truth, and so had I. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I felt lighter than I had in years. I wasn't just a wife who had been abandoned. I was a woman who had reclaimed everything she'd been told to trust to someone else. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control of the next chapter, and this time, I was the one holding the pen,